I'm David Boote. I'm the coordinator of the Waltham Forest History and Heritage Network. I'm inviting everybody who's joining us for this Zoom talk by Esther Freeman. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Particularly grateful to Esther for offering to give a talk. And the Waltham Forest History and Heritage Network is basically an umbrella group for various historical interest groups within the Borough of Waltham Forest, and allowing private individuals with a particular interest in the history or the heritage of Waltham Forest to participate. And I think one thing the network can do is expand, broaden the reach of local history, the extent of its subject matter. So it's not just about churches and rich people and things, but about human life in all kinds of aspects. And Esther is an ideal person to have talk to us because she has an interest in women and the role of the female gender in society, which until pretty recently was very much subjugated to the male. So Esther's going to give her talk, and Esther, I know, is very good at communicating local history. She leads local walks on this kind of subject, one of which I followed. And I particularly admire Esther because, like a few other people I know, they not only do their research and work out how to communicate it, but they manage to win funding for it, which is probably the most difficult task of the three. So, and Esther does that. I'm a huge admirer of the various strands of what she's done to achieve the talk this evening. So I'd like to hand over to Esther.
Okay, David, thank you very much. That was an amazing introduction. Yes, so I'm just going to share my screen now because I've got some slides to show for this presentation. And hopefully you should be able to see me as well as hear me as I do that, but give me a shout if there's any problems. So yeah, my name is Esther Freeman, and I am a social historian, and I have been researching women activists of East London since 2015, and I work for an organisation called Share UK, which is a non-profit community group that is based in Walthamstow, which is where I live as well. Yeah, as David said, we've had quite a bit of funding to do this. Most of it's come from the Heritage Lottery Fund, although tonight's talk is supported by the Barrier Mill and Norman Melbourne Trust. I should give them a little plug. So the reason it came about was because as I was researching women activists, I kept finding things about equal pay, and it seemed to be that there was a lot of sort of women in East London who were campaigning on this issue, but their story, we know about the Dagenham Ford machinists, who we will talk about tonight, but apart from that, we don't seem to have a collated source of all this information. So I felt like I wanted to do that, and it felt quite pertinent that this stuff was happening in East London, because a lot of it was driven by unions, or although not the big unions, as we will get onto in a bit. It was driven by unions because people used to join unions when they felt under threat. Before we had like national insurance and things, it was their security. And you tend to see higher union membership in dangerous trades where there is a higher threat. So you get more membership in roles like coal mining than you do in journalism, which is a lot safer. And in East London, people were working a lot of quite dangerous jobs. So they would be facing industrial accidents, there would be in-work poverty. The threat for them was very real. So I think that's why I found all these stories. But during this talk, I will also talk a little bit about some other things going on in the rest of the country, because whatever was happening in East London was being reflected elsewhere as well. It's like a little microcosm what happens in this corner of the country. So we're going to go back to the 1830s to start this talk. And there are 4 recorded calls for pay parity in this decade, 4 different campaigns around the country, including one in London. However, they were rather short-lived and not very successful. And after this point, between around the 1850s and 1880s was not a very good time for women workers, as this is the era where the notion of the family wage took hold. And this is the idea that the man should earn enough to look after his family, and it was not desirable, shameful even, that women should go out to work. And we've got this little image here that the text is a little bit difficult to read, but it basically says her mission in life is to look after her family and her husband, and she thrives and adores that kind of work. The reality, of course, was that this was not necessarily the situation for a lot of women, particularly working class women in East London. It might be that their husband could not find work. It might be that their husband was in work but not earning enough from that job to support his family. Or there's also quite high numbers of recorded matrimonial abandonment. So a lot of husbands just disappearing and leaving the wife to support the family by herself. So the fact was, a lot of women had to go out to work whether they liked it or not. So this situation didn't really change much for the rest of that century. But then in 1906, this woman came along, and her name is Mary MacArthur, and she founded the National Federation of Women Workers. Now, this organization was significant because it took women's union membership to a completely different level. So there had been unions before. Well, there was obviously the main unions that had been around for years, like the TUC, but they were not supportive of women's labour rights at all. There were other unions that were for women, but calling them a union is a little bit of a sort of loose definition. I mean, really, they were kind of friendly societies and they didn't have a lot of teeth to them at all. So the National Federation of Women Workers came along and really changed all of that. Mary was an extraordinary leader, and she arguably did more than any other organisational leader for working women's rights. So she didn't directly campaign for equal pay, but she campaigned around these issues, and as such made quite a big difference to working women's lives. So one of the things that she did was campaign around securing a minimum wage, and she particularly focused on sweated trades. And that included, she rather famously led out workers in the Black Country in the chain making trade. So there was a lot of women making chains. And Mary had actually successfully secured a minimum wage in law, which the Chain Trade Board rejected and refused to pay the women this minimum wage because it was basically going to double their salaries. And Mary led the women in these factories out on strike and was enormously successful. And also just, I mean, she was employing tactics which seem every day now, but considering the age, so she did things like she used the newly formed cinema to take out adverts, and she networked with everyone from the media to trade unions to the gentry. I mean, she really knew how to network and do her PR in an age where all of that was obviously quite new and unsophisticated. One of the areas that she focused on in East London was around biscuit and jam making factories, which were quite significant in the area in this era. And she worked with a woman called Helen Bowden Pease, and she sent Helen over to East London to try and organise the women in the factories. Now, Helen claims in an oral history interview that she was warmly welcomed by the women. Quote, "They liked us speaking on their behalf, and they used to like seeing middle-class educated women coming into their neighbourhood." So this is where we see some of the sort of shortfalls of oral history. They're obviously her words. We don't have the opinions of the local women because they weren't recorded, and the person we recorded was a middle-class educated woman. So I take that with a little bit of pinch of salt. It might be true, but I have read other things that suggest actually working women, there was a lot of mixed feelings about some of these women coming in and telling them what to do. That said, they did get huge union membership sign up, and they did make a huge difference to these women. Now, they tried to improve the pay for these women, but that wasn't very successful. And that was partly because prior to the formation of these factories, most women would have gone into domestic service, which involved very long hours. You were cut off from your family, had very little time off. You were subject to sexual abuse quite often, and it was appallingly paid. So in comparison, the factories were actually quite well paid, and you had more time to yourself and sort of more control over your life. So comparatively, the factories were better work, but they were still very difficult environments. So I just want to talk a little bit about the jam making factories. So there was a very big jam making factory down in Bermondsey, and the conditions there were pretty horrendous, quite honestly. Working with very hot, dangerous materials. Safety was very lax. There was a local newspaper cutting that talked about a woman falling through a walkway above some boiling vats of water, and she fell into it to her death, basically. They also had to endure carrying incredibly heavy weights. It was about 2 or 3 times what is legally allowed today. And these were women who were often, because of the living on the breadline, they were often emaciated. They were almost constantly pregnant. They might be both those two things. So the physical strain on their bodies must have been huge. And most of them were working there because they had to. In a survey, they talked about how their husbands didn't earn enough, so they had to earn money to supplement their income, or their husbands couldn't find work. So instead of focusing on the pay, they tended to focus on the conditions, and they did secure a number of wins. And according to Helen, the project had quite a bit of impact, and by the end of the war, the conditions had greatly improved. So we're going to move on now to talk about a group I'm sure some of you know about. This is the East London Federation of Suffragettes. And in this picture, we can see the woman who's sort of standing above the crowd is Malvina Walker. She is not particularly well known, but I've done a little bit of research on her, and she's a really fascinating woman. And I actually have a new podcast series called Rebel Women, where I've done a 5-part series on equal pay. So if you want to kind of explore any of that after this session, do go and check that out. It's on iTunes, Google Play, and many other platforms. I mention it because there is an episode about Malvina Walker if you want to discover her more, but she was just one of many working class suffragettes in East London. Now, there were many different suffragette groups, and when World War I broke out, they all responded slightly differently. Many of them supported the war. The East London Federation of Suffragettes didn't, though. And that was partly because their campaign for the vote had always been tied in with the Labour movement, and saw that gaining the vote for women was a route out of poverty. And they saw that the war was actually making the situation even worse for people in East London. So one of the things that happened initially was that the factories all just closed down because the men left for war and there was no people to run the factories. We then see spiraling food prices, and this is because a lot of food was being sent overseas to support the troops, and food that was trying to come into the country was being targeted by the enemy. So there was just a shortage of food that was causing prices to spiral. And then we have just a rush of unemployment as well. In 1916, the situation started to change slightly as the factories began to open up again, having repurposed themselves, many moving into making things like munitions or other equipment and materials for the war. 1916 is also when we see conscription of women, and they suddenly realize that they have this workforce, and if actually they just kind of open their eyes to the fact that women could come in and do these work, then actually you can get the factories up and running again. So they were kind of, their hand was forced into allowing women into the workplace. So women started to go and work in munitions factories and all sorts of other places that they'd been either poorly represented or not represented at all in the past. However, they were paid significantly less than men. On average, a factory manager could employ 2 to 3 women to replace the one man who had left the war. That's how big the discrepancy was. And this created huge problems for East London women because their husbands were gone and they were trying to raise families on this much reduced income while the food prices were still spiraling. So they still have a family to feed, but on much less money than if they were men. So Sylvia Pankhurst, who led the East London Federation of Suffragettes, took up this cause and began a campaign of lobbying and letter writing around equal pay. And they went up to Whitehall and they had marches and waved their banners and chanted equal pay for equal work. And Sylvia Pankhurst bombarded Lloyd George with letters demanding social justice. And in 1915, she actually had a bit of success because the government agreed that the women should be paid the same piece rates as men. So that is the same amount for what they physically produce as the men. So for each item that's coming off the factory line, they will be paid the same as men. However, the conditions were not the same on time rates. So what the employers did was just switch the women over from paying piece rates to time rates. And this is quite an important thing to hold on to because this tinkering with pay and work structures we will see happen again and again to deny women full equality. So moving on to 1918 now. And one of the industries that saw huge numbers of women go into it was transport. And they worked across the sector as porters, conductors, and even in some cases, drivers. And in 1918, the men were offered a 5-shilling war bonus, which was not offered to the women. And the women at the Waltham bus depot met in secret one evening without telling their employers, without telling their union, and they agreed that the next day they would go out and strike over this 1-shilling war bonus. And the strike took people by surprise, but it also had a lot of support. And it soon spread across London and the southeast. And in fact, Hackney bus depot went out on strike, and it was one of the first to do so. And it then spread from London and the southeast as far away as Birmingham and Wales. And within a week, 18,000 women had stopped work and brought city and town centres to a standstill. They also had a number of men join the strike in solidarity, and also a number of tube workers joined the strike in solidarity. They protested under the slogan, "The same work for the same money." And they would have these regular get-togethers, which had a sort of almost festival atmosphere to them. They'd bring along picnics and they'd have their sandwiches and they'd bring the kids along and the kids would play, and there would be chanting and singing, but there would also be political discussions. And it was felt that actually it wasn't just about the fact that they were getting paid far less than the men when they were doing exactly the same work. So they expanded out their demands and wanted equal pay for equal work. So within a few days, the strike was settled, and within a month, the women got their bonus. However, they didn't get their claims for equal pay, and it did cause a little bit of a split in the group, because there were some who felt that they should have held out longer for equal pay. I guess we will never quite know whether that would have been a successful strategy. I think personally, I think they did pretty well in this era to have even got that bonus. So this is kind of one of our first quite solid wins on the equal pay front, even if we're not getting full equal pay yet. So we're now heading into the interwar period, and this is a time where women's activism takes a bit of a sort of downturn. In 1918, we have the People's Representation Act, which gave some women the vote. And without this campaign for the vote to unite them, the different factions of women activists started to really show. I mentioned before that actually their response to the war was very different. We had Sylvia Pankhurst, who's quite a staunch pacifist, whereas her mother and sister were colonialists and actually directed some of the money that they had raised for their suffragette activities into the government's war funds, which I always find highly ironic. Literally, like 1 week they're campaigning in a very militant style against the government, and then almost like the next week they're giving them money for the war effort. But there were other ways in which their differences showed up as well, and this is an era of big class conflict and many other issues which started to divide them. So the kind of the movements fell apart a bit, and there wasn't a huge lot going on in this area, except in one sector, and that is what I want to talk about now, and that is education. So one profession where women were clearly doing the same work as men, but being paid considerably less, was teaching. And this was a profession where there were a lot of women in it, and they were kind of by definition the brightest and the best, because to become a teacher, you often were initially promoted to as a pupil teacher, and then you could take further qualifications and become a fully qualified teacher. And so you could actually come from quite a poor background, but be quite bright and make it up to this professional career, which was well paid and had high status. And as a result, a lot of these women were suffragettes. And because they had come from this suffragette background, they brought these political ideas about women's equality into the teaching profession. However, it wasn't particularly warmly welcomed by the men in the profession, and including the NUT, the National Union of Teachers. So during the campaign, the struggle for women's suffrage, they had a number of times tried to get the NUT to support their demands for votes for women, and had rejected. And so when they started calling for equal pay, it was also not particularly well received. And growing tired of not just the NUT's lack of interest, but actually they began to actively campaign against the women. Some of them decided that it was best that they just actually split away from them, and they formed in 1913, they formed the National Federation of Women Teachers, and its honorary secretary became Ethel Froude, who worked in a school in West Ham, and you can see her in this picture. She's the lady in the rather lovely white hat. So Ethel was known as a brilliant organizer, unifier, and speaker, and she addressed demonstrations of teachers campaigning for equal pay in Trafalgar Square on several occasions. So it was quite a struggle for them. They had a lot of, they were brilliant organizers themselves, but they had a significant proportion of the male teaching workforce against them. We then hit the war, where a lot of the male teachers went off for war. And when they came back, they decided they wanted their jobs back and they wanted the women out of the industry. This is a time of economic depression. A lot of these men had what we would call now PTSD. They were emotionally and mentally injured by the war, and they unleashed some of that on these women teachers, and were very intent on getting them out of the sector. So the marriage bar, which had been, they got rid of the marriage bar during the war because they needed lots of women teachers to come in and fill the roles of men. And when the war ended, they reintroduced the marriage bar, and the women campaigned fearlessly against the marriage bar, trying to get it removed. And for anyone who doesn't understand the marriage bar, this meant that when a woman got married, she had to leave the profession. And interestingly, I found out the other day, my grandmother was a teacher, and she got married very late. She was like 33 or something, and I found out that was because of the marriage bar. She knew as soon as she got married she'd have to leave, and she loved teaching, she loved children, and so this is what they would have to do. And there was other stories I found of women who got married in secret and had to live separately so they could hold on to their careers. So they were campaigning on equal pay and the marriage bar. And they had quite a fight, and if I'm honest, they didn't make a lot of headway on either issue during this period. But we will come back to this issue because it does resurface again, and I think that the work that women like Ethel did in this era did have an impact on what would happen later on. So we're moving now on to World War II. And we'll see women back into the workplace once again, but on average, once again, being paid 53% less than the men they replaced. And the injustice of this was felt even more strongly this time because women were taken on more skilled roles, such as engineering and working as pilots, proving themselves capable in these roles. And during this era, there would be some limited but temporary equal pay claims won. Mention my podcast again because I do have an episode on the women engineers and the women pilots, who were two groups of women who were successful in securing some equal pay claims during this era. So if you want to delve into that a bit more, do check out that podcast. It's called Rebel Women. However, as I mentioned, these wins were rather temporary, and they were limited within skilled professions. Semi-skilled and unskilled workers still got nothing. However, we do see that these little sort of moments that we've had up until now, do move the discussion along. And in 1943, the government set up the Equal Pay Committee, and in 1944 launched the Royal Commission on Equal Pay. In 1946, the Commission tentatively agreed that some grades of the civil service and teachers may benefit from equal pay. So this is what I was talking about before, that although the teachers in the 20s and 30s didn't have much success, they were one of the first professions when we start to see these equal pay policies coming in. I feel personally that kind of paid off for them eventually. However, they would still have to wait a very long time for it. So for the some grades of the civil service would receive equal pay in 1955, and teachers would get their claims in 1961. However, this was the limit of it. Basically, we still have nothing protecting and supporting women in the private sector. And post-war, the campaign for equal pay kind of went off the boil, as yet again, women were encouraged to go back into the home. And actually, many wanted to do so as well, because the challenges of juggling domestic responsibilities and childcare during the war had really taken its toll on women, and they were just exhausted. There's an excellent book called Millions Like Us by Virginia Nicholson. It's a very entertaining, easy read. I think she's a journalist, so we see the journalists who write history books do it rather well. But it talks about this fatigue, like sort of emotional fatigue that a lot of women had, and why it actually took to the kind of following generation of women to get the women's liberation movement. So I really recommend that book. It's a good read. So even with the establishment of the welfare state in 1948, we don't really see much change on this front. In fact, the welfare state was based around the notion of the family unit with the male breadwinner. The role of women in social production was secondary to her domestic duties. The Labour government argued that equal pay was, quote, inappropriate at the present time because of the continuing need for counter-inflationary policies. And this position was supported by the TUC. By the mid-50s, all political parties had announced their support for equal pay, but throughout the next 2 decades, they would use economic risk as a reason not to implement it. So the issue of equal pay may have been forgotten about altogether if it had not been for a group of women at the Ford Dagenham factory. Now, this is probably the story that if you've heard about something about equal pay, this will be it. It's the film Made in Dagenham is based on these women. But there are some interesting elements to this story that you may not know about that sometimes get missed out. So I just want to spend a moment exploring them. So if you don't know them, the women worked as machinists, so they were stitching upholstery in cars, and they complained that they were being paid less than the men in similar roles. And this eventually led to a strike at the Ford Dagenham factory, which was very significant because although they were only a small part of a small cog in the machinery, if you don't have car seats, you don't have cars. So they actually managed to bring the entire production to a standstill. Like, cars were just not coming off the factory lines at all. And the Ford Dagenham factory was, it was certainly the biggest in the UK. I think it was one of the biggest in Europe as well. And also they triggered strikes elsewhere in the country. I think there was another one in Merseyside, which was another significant plant. So they were really having an economic impact. And business leaders, not just in car manufacturing, but across the sector, were getting very worried about this. This is 1969. In 1968, we just had, have all the anti-Vietnam War protests, we've got the civil rights movement going on, just sort of coming to well, not to an end, but just dipped from its peak in the US. And importantly, in France, we'd had the May 68 riots that nearly escalated in full-scale revolution. So people were nervous. And so into this sort of chaos, I suppose we could call it, strives Barbara Castle, who was the employment secretary at the time. And she actually negotiated with the management at Ford to try and forestall further walkouts. And she initially managed to get a grade reclass. So she got an increase in salary for the women so that they were within their pay grade. They were on the more or less, I think, they're equal to the men. And then she kind of used this as a springboard to introduce the Equal Pay Bill. And she brought that into Parliament. And in 1970, the Equal Pay Act was passed. And this act got rid of, so I'm just going to explain for those who don't know how this all used to work, because it can get a little bit complicated. So I find a sort of visual help. So you would have different pay scales. At the top, you've got skilled, then you've got semi-skilled, and then you've got B, unskilled, and A, women. So the Act got rid of the category for women. You could no longer pay women lower rates of pay if they were doing broadly the same work as men. The Act also brought in the right to ask for a pay grade reassessment with a view to being put on a different pay scale. So there was a lot of jubilation in Westminster over this. It was something that Barbara Castle had been campaigning for actually quite a long time. And she personally was very happy with it. However, the women in Dagenham were not so happy, actually, because it didn't really change their situation. So they had been put on the B grade, and although they were now being paid the same as the men on the B grade, what they'd always argued was their work was not unskilled. They were machinists, and when they applied for the job, they had to do a test to prove that they could handle a sewing machine. They also argued that when things were quiet in their sector, they'd go over and help the men in their sector. But when the reverse happened and the men were quiet, they were never sent over to help the women, because in the words of one woman, they didn't even know how to thread a needle. So they were arguing that they should be on C grade, not B grade. And they argued this case for 16 years. Each year they requested a pay grade reassessment, as the new law allowed them to, and each year it was rejected. And then finally, in 1986, they walked out on strike again. And they actually had quite a lot of support for them for this. The postal workers stopped delivering mail to the factory. The lorry drivers chopped up wood for their fires because they were there day and night in the freezing cold. And the police would come along and check they were okay, and bring them a bottle of whiskey. And eventually the management settled and agreed to put them on C grade. So this is what I was talking about before when we talked about Sylvia Pankhurst and the East London Federation of Suffragettes, that the management always seemed to have a way of like tweaking these pay structures so that women's work is always remains devalued and therefore lower paid. And this is something that we still see today. So this woman here is called Jean Geldart, and she is a trade union activist in Tower Hamlets. And in the 1990s, she was involved in a campaign to get low-paid women council workers equal pay. There were a number of women in manual jobs who were being paid a lower rate than men in manual jobs because the jobs were seen as less important. And the campaign was very successful and succeeded in getting thousands of women's workers large amounts of back pay in compensation, as well as pay regrading. However, this problem does still continue today, and this is what we mean by talking about the gender pay gap. So we know we don't tend to talk about equal pay anymore, because we did have the Equal Pay Act, which in 2010 was built into the Equalities Act, but we do still have this pay disparity, and it's often around the way that women's work is classified. So at the moment, we have a number of outstanding claims by women's supermarket workers at Asda's, Tesco's and Morrison's, who are fighting in the courts over the fact that they are paid less. So the shop floor workers, which is work predominantly done by women, are paid less than the warehouse workers, which is work predominantly done by men. And yes, of course, these are different jobs, but there's no clear reason why one is classed as more skilled than other. They're just different types of skill. The warehouse workers are doing sort of heavy lifting, but then the shop floor workers are having to deal with customer complaints and using what is often termed, I hate this term, but soft skills. And this is the point, is those soft skills are often devalued. So this time I'm pleased to say that the unions are supporting these women. We have also seen some successful pay claims for council workers up in Glasgow. So we'll have to see what happens with the supermarket workers. But certainly this problem of gender pay disparity is very widespread. We hear a lot in the news about some of the high earners at the BBC, the women workers getting not as quite many noughts on the end of their salaries as the men. And of course, that's not fair, but I think it's also really important to remember the women at the bottom end of those pay scales who are fighting these cases in supermarkets and things, because as with the Dagenham Ford machinists, they always argued that people thought that they were working just for a bit of pin money that would pay for the niceties in life, but actually the reason they were campaigning and fighting this were because they really needed that extra money to pay for their mortgage and to pay the bills. And this is with the women workers in the supermarkets and the manual workers at Tower Hamlets is the same issue. This is an issue of like keeping yourself out of poverty. So currently the gender pay gap stands at 19.9% across all employment. The TUC has made the 6th of March Women's Pay Day, as women's salaries are so out of alignment with men's, they must effectively work the first 65 days of the year for free. We must learn from history and understand that tweaking the classifications is not enough, because employers will just reorganize their pay structures and continue to pay less. We must better value the women's work so we generally have equal pay for equal work. So that ends the presentation, and I will stop sharing my screen now and see if there's some questions in the chat. Shall I just go through these?
I think there's just a couple of statements.
Yes, I could read that out if people could just see them. In World War II, my mother made Lancaster sites and was enraged that the male conscientious objectors sweeping the poor paid more than the women. Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah, I mean, that was a situation that was common across the country, I think. Were there any other questions?
Whilst people are thinking, could I thank you, Esther, for your talk, which you delivered in a wonderfully eloquent yet very pleasant way, which I always admire.
Thank you.
We learnt a lot, but we learnt it very, very pleasantly.
Good.
And I know some healthy skepticism from time to time, which I think is important in history. Otherwise, it sounds like some propaganda rather than history. But no, I greatly admire the way you gave your talk, and I'm very grateful to you for it.
And what I'll just do as well, we have a mailing list. So if people are sort of interested in this or the other work that we're doing more broadly around sort of women's heritage, join the list, and
I can send an email to everyone that booked with.
Okay.
If you email me what you want me to send round, I can.
Okay, I'll pop it in here as well, because I've got just put it there if anyone wants to join. Oh, okay. Well, how were stories recorded? Did women write diaries? So where did I find stuff? No, there weren't particularly diaries. It's always very hard finding the stories of sort of working class women. There's quite some good sort of biographies of people like Ethel Froude. There's some good sort of biographies of her, and actually Minnie Lansbury, who I didn't get to talk about here, but she was another. She was a suffragette. She was one of the popular rebel councillors and campaigned for equal pay as well. And Janine Booth has done an extraordinarily thorough job on her biography, which is often just trawling through archives. I'm trying to think. There people like the women pilots, there's quite a lot that's been written on them now. I mentioned some of the oral history recordings that I found of Helen Bowden Pease, which are nice because they kind of give a little bit more colour to them. But it's mostly a case, the stories of the actual women, other than the Dagenham Ford machinists, who there's been a lot of work done with them. There's a lot of video, I found quite a few videos of them, lots of interviews in various media with them. So they're probably the ones who've been covered best, but it's really the kind of leading figures, the biographies of them. We're always kind of missing the voices of the working class women, and it's just been a continual struggle. So it's always about sort of trying to piece things together from those other sources to try and work out what these women's lives were like. There was a sizable crowd of Black women in the 1930s in Canning Town where their stories gathered. So technically, we don't, I mean, I did briefly mention Bermondsey, but we don't cover, when we look at East London, we look at Waltham Forest, Tower Hamlets, Hackney and Newham. I've not come across stories of many Black women from those communities at all, really. From the 1970s, you start to get quite a lot of stories from Asian women, and and I was actually interviewing a Black woman who's a kind of contemporary campaigner, and she said that part of that issue is that while there are quite a lot of Black families and community members in the area, they're not quite as consolidated as they are in places like Brixton. So they're just a bit more disparate. And she grew up around here, and she said it never felt like a community in the way that it does sort of down in Brixton, which is possibly why it was a struggle to find those stories in those areas. Oh, lots of questions coming in now. Where is the activity to achieve real parity in the UK happening now? Some companies still seem to be able to hide their figures. Yes, well, I think there is an attempt to try and get them. I think they have to publish their data now. I haven't quite kept up to what the contemporary situation, but I know that there was a move to try and get companies to publish their data on the gender pay, and the ONS certainly collects data on it. But there is this kind of complicated question. So the ONS say that one of the big issues for the disparity is because a lot of women, when they have kids, go to work part-time. But then, of course, that raises questions about childcare and the fact that we still don't really have adequate childcare that kind of forces women into these situations, and we don't have the sharing of childcare. I understand, I finally found this out on Monday night, that Walthamstow MP Stella Creasy is apparently doing some work around this at the moment, but I don't know exactly what it is. So that might be one area to look in if you want to find out what's happening now. And then, of course, there's these supermarkets worker claims, and there is a particular legal firm whose name I can't remember, that is championing those. So that's kind of as far as things are at the moment. The cat has left it to the end, at least, to interrupt. I imagine with reduced union membership and lack of knowledge in migrant groups, some unscrupulous employers must be guilty of underpayment of wage theft amongst poorly paid women. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we have all these zero contracts hours happening, which obviously affect either gender. There is a new union which is quite small. I've forgotten what it's called. It's something United Workers of the World or something, that particularly focuses on those migrant groups and the zero contract hours. And I think they've been doing a lot of work with cleaners who are predominantly women. They're a really interesting organisation, definitely one to watch. With the market a signal part, keeps moving, of Walthamstow culture, what was work like for the women there? I don't know, because I'm not specifically researching work. I'm researching the women who sort of campaigned. We didn't come across anyone who was campaigning around things that were going on in the market. So afraid that's sort of a little bit out of the scope of what we were doing, but it's an interesting question. I have no idea what it was like. I don't know if anyone else has looked into that. It'd be quite interesting. There must have been literature around 1906 saying women didn't need to have equal pay because they're lesser humans. It is hard to think of that in 2020. Well, some of the arguments around why women didn't need to have equal pay was this notion of the male breadwinner. And certainly one of the arguments that was thrown at the teachers was the reason men needed to be paid more was because they had a family to support. But actually, they didn't take into consideration that they did a survey, and actually it was something like a third of male teachers weren't married. And then there was another big chunk of women teachers who were supporting elderly parents. So that was one of the big arguments that was used and was complete nonsense. And the women teachers did try to deconstruct that. Yeah, so, and then of course, this whole, as we kind of get into the sort of 60s and the Dagenham Ford machine, as I mentioned, the idea of that was set up with the welfare state and the notion of the household of the male breadwinner, and that women may go out to work, but their money just paid for the nice things like the new washing machine or the holiday and things like that. It was pin money, and so they didn't need to be paid as much because it wasn't supported. It's not only this idea that the man supports the family, but as we saw right at the sort of beginning of the discussion when I talked about women needing to work, that was still the case in the 60s and 70s, and probably even now, that women often need to work because their male partners are not being paid enough, they can't find work. And the Dagenham Ford machinist did say it was not pin money to us, it was desperately needed to pay for our rents and our mortgages. So those were the main arguments that we used. Can you say more about immediately local activism across the years, women in Waltham Forest and the borders? So I have to be honest that I didn't find a huge amount specifically from Waltham Forest. So a lot of it was in Tower, because as I said, our area covers Tower Hamlets, Hackney, Waltham Forest and Newham. A lot of it was focused around Tower Hamlets because a lot of it was being driven by the East London Federation of Suffragettes, for example. Now I have recently been reading, going back to diaries, I have been reading some diaries recently of a woman who was a suffragette, and her stepsister was a member of the East London Federation of Suffragettes who would go down to Bow from Walthamstow. So the chances are there were women going down and supporting that organisation, but I didn't find any specific examples within Waltham Forest. But then, as I talked about before, in more contemporary terms, we are seeing that now with people like Stella Creasy, who have been quite vocal on the issue of the gender pay gap. And I think some of this is kind of about the changing nature of Waltham Forest, because with the coming of the railways, people moved from Bow, as I'm sure many of you know this, but people moved from Bow and Tower Hamlets up to Walthamstow and wider in Waltham Forest because they had made money. And my theory is that they therefore didn't need to campaign as much because their lives were better. Like the women were maybe not trying to cope with all the things that the women in Bow were struggling with in the outbreak of war and things. They were kind of, they had a little bit more money, they were a little bit more comfortable, so maybe it just didn't quite register. All those stories just didn't get collected. It's, you know, it's always hard to tell because there's such poor cataloguing of the stories of ordinary women. But certainly so far, at least, I haven't come across that many on the issue of equal pay in Waltham Forest. So sorry about that. Don't know if that's all the questions. Some good questions there, I quite like those. Yeah.
Do you want to say anything else, David?
I wanted to thank Esther for answering the questions in just as lively a manner as she gave her talk. I'm sure she's created some extra interest in this subject area from the people who've listened to Esther this evening. Really inspiring. And I wanted also, Joanna, to thank you because you've set up this Zoom session with an Eventbrite background to it. And you've been updating the website of the Waltham Forest History and Heritage Network. So I'm very grateful for everything you're doing for the network and for allowing these Zoom talks to take place. Thank you very much.
That's all right.
Yes, thank you, Joanna.
That's okay. Thanks. Okay, I'll end the meeting, and it will be recorded and visible on our YouTube channel on so it's Waltham Forest History and Heritage Network on YouTube in a couple of days, and also on our website if you want to share it with anyone, and I'll send the link round to everybody. So I'm going to press the end button now, but hope to see you at another talk.
Bye.